I warn you against shedding blood, indulging in it, or making a habit of it, for blood never sleeps. Saladin. During the second half of the 12th century, a dramatic Muslim revival reaches its zenith under the command of Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a courageous and brilliant leader, known to contemporary Muslims as al-Nasir, the victorious, and to Europeans as Saladin. He seeks nothing less than to unite all Muslims between the Euphrates and the Nile against a common enemy. In late 11th century, the Fatimid Caliphate is in decline, and the Seljuk Empire is crumbling. In this period of Muslim weakness, the First Crusade strikes the Levant. Christian lords and knights impose institutions of Western Europe upon the social and political structures of the conquered lands. Their rule is relatively stable, largely thanks to Muslim disunity. But as 12th century rolls on, less than 5 decades since European crusaders arrived in the region, the Zengid dynasty rises to prominence in northern Levant. Under competent leadership of Imad ad-Din Zengi, they defeat the Crusaders and retake the city of Edessa in 1144, thus in effect provoking the Pope to call for the Second Crusade. Although Imad is assassinated 2 years later, in 1146, his son Nur ad-Din successfully continues the fight against the Crusaders, until the Second Crusade eventually fizzles out, and he expands his father's realm over the years, bringing much-needed stability and prosperity to his people. It is during Nur ad-Din's reign that Saladin begins his rise to prominence. Born in 1137 in Tikrit, in modern-day Iraq, Saladin spends his formative years in Damascus. From a young age, he is educated in Greek philosophy, mathematics, poetry, astronomy, law, and above all, he becomes an ardent student of the Quran and theology. His upbringing is helped by members of his family who served as skillful diplomats and administrators, first in the Seljuk Empire and later for the Zengid dynasty. Growing up, Saladin's uncle Shirkuh and Nur ad-Din became his biggest role models. They instilled in him the principles of chivalry, piety, nobility, justice, humility, generosity, brotherhood, mercy, and forgiveness, all of which would come to define Saladin's life and legacy. He joins the military at the age of 14 and is ably trained by his uncle Shirkuh, a military commander in the Zengid army. A quick learner, Saladin soon impresses his mentor. His performance in early battles enables him to take on leading responsibilities in military campaigns, and over the years he distinguishes himself through his bravery, military leadership, sharp intellect, and loyalty to his leaders. Saladin's star truly begins to rise during the 1160s, when Nur ad-Din decides to intervene in the affairs of the weakening Fatimid Caliphate, aiming to forestall Amalric's quest to expand the Kingdom of Jerusalem into Egypt. Recognized as a competent, trustworthy, and ambitious leader, in 1164, Saladin is sent to Egypt as part of the command structure of a Zengid army commanded by his uncle Shirkuh. He becomes an integral part of several campaigns over the years, and his uncle's second-in-command. By early 1169, the army of Amalric Thrush, king of Jerusalem, is finally expelled from Egypt. Saladin's uncle Shirkuh is named vizier of the Fatimid Caliph, Al-Adid, which gives Nur ad-Din de facto control over Egypt. But just 1 month later, in March 1169, Shirkuh suddenly dies after a short illness. Without his right-hand man, Nur ad-Din's influence in Egypt is threatened. And Al-Adid senses an opportunity to strengthen his own position and quickly appoints Saladin without waiting for a decision from Damascus, thinking that a young vizier with no political power in Egypt will be easy to control. However, the 31-year-old Saladin proves to be more than what Al-Adid has bargained for. The young vizier takes advantage of the Fatimid political system, and through clever tactics, he gradually installs his close family members in key government and military positions, which enables him to consolidate his power enough to overthrow and dissolve the Fatimid Shia Caliphate just 2 years later in 1171, thus founding the Ayyubid dynasty. Saladin can now concentrate on strengthening Egypt as a bastion of Sunni Muslim power, with himself as governor in the name of Nur ad-Din. He revitalizes the economy, establishes civic institutions, and greatly improves education by building a law college in Alexandria and a vast number of schools all over Egypt, giving school administrators and teachers good salaries, which attracts many scholars from across Asia and Europe, turning Egypt into an intellectual powerhouse of the 12th century. He abolishes tolls for Muslim pilgrims who cross the Red Sea, and pays compensation to Mecca for any loss of income. A shrewd move that makes him popular among the people, and also makes him a patron of Mecca. Saladin transforms Egypt into a salient against the Crusaders by creating an entirely new army, loyal only to him, and starts rebuilding the navy to protect Egypt's coasts. Military forays soon follow to secure and expand the borders, first against Nubia, where hostile remnants of the Fatimid establishment still persist, then into Libya, where Ibid armies push west to Tripoli and expel the Norman occupiers, although Saladin never manages to consolidate his authority west of the province of Barca. Most importantly, Saladin turns his attention towards tightening his grip over Hejaz and captures Yemen, thus gaining control over the Red Sea and its vast maritime trading potential, which immensely increases Egypt's commercial wealth. By all accounts, Saladin is actively building an empire which creates friction with Nur ad-Din, his master in Syria. Tensions rise and almost result in conflict. But then Nur ad-Din dies suddenly in 1174, probably of a heart attack. In the ensuing power vacuum, his 11-year-old son As-Salih cannot fill the void left by his father's death. But Saladin can, and he now sees before him a grand vision. He can unite Egypt and Syria for a holy war against the Christian invaders. He proclaims the need for unity and jihadas, reasons to intervene in Syria. And his claims are not without merit. By controlling the Red Sea, and by reconquering the area south of the Shahbak Castle, Saladin is already recognized as the liberator of the Hajj Road. Securing pilgrimage routes from Sudan and Egypt to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina earns him a lot of credibility, and as a result, his arrival into Syria is much welcomed by ordinary people, but not so much by some members of the Zengid dynasty. Nevertheless, Saladin brings most of the Zengid territory under his control either through diplomacy or military intervention, becoming the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Meanwhile, across the border, King Amalric of Jerusalem plans to exploit the political instability in Syria and expand his territory. But he dies of dysentery in July 1174. In Saladin's view, Amalric's death is a sign of God's favor. With the throne passing on to Baldwin IV, a mere boy suffering from leprosy, and the Frankish nobles angling for positions in the kingdom, the threat of a major Christian invasion subsides. But Saladin knows that the time is not yet right to fight the Crusaders, as he must consolidate his position against Nur ad-Din's relatives who still pose a threat from their bases in Aleppo and Mosul. But as Baldwin IV matures, the kingdom adopts a proactive foreign policy. The Crusaders then try to take Hama and Haram, but fail in the attempt. In 1177, Saladin responds by leading a large invasion force into the Kingdom of Jerusalem to counter the Frankish aggression. Baldwin, now 16 years old, despite being vastly outnumbered, proves he is a capable leader, able to unite his nobles against the Muslim threat. And with the help of Reynaud of Chatillon, his second in command, he manages to catch Saladin by surprise at Montgizard due to a rare tactical error by the Sultan. Saladin suffers a crushing defeat, narrowly escaping with his own life, with many in his army killed or taken prisoner. But Baldwin lacks the resources to follow up on the victory, and the Sultan manages to regroup. In April 1179, Saladin strikes back and decisively defeats Baldwin in the Golan region, nearly capturing the king. Another Christian army is defeated in June of the same year, and just 2 months later, an important Templar fortress situated on the pilgrimage route is destroyed. Finally, in 1180, Saladin and Baldwin agree a 2-year truce. But even before the ink is dry, it is clear that the mighty fortress of Kerak will become the next flashpoint. Virtually impenetrable atop a steep hill, with its 80-meter entrance tunnel and walls thick enough to withstand the battering of siege weapons, Kerak is the home of Reynaud of Chatillon. His fortress sits on the key road between Damascus and Mecca, and from there the Baron is able to tax, raid, and rob the passing camel caravans of traders and pilgrims. Truce or no truce? Reynaud thinks that Muslims should not be allowed to pass freely. In the summer of 1181, he rides deep into Arabia and intercepts a major Muslim caravan, strips the traveleres of their possessions, and takes many prisoners. Saladin demands compensation from Baldwin, but the king cannot force Reynald to recompense. Saladin holds a group of Christian pilgrims hostage in Damietta as leverage, but Reynald still refuses to free the Muslim pilgrims. In response, Christian pilgrims are sold into slavery. Then, in 1182, Reynald puts more strain on the already delicate truce. The rogue crusader sends troops via Red Sea, declaring that he will destroy the Kaaba and exhume the Prophet's tomb in Hejaz. But thanks to Saladin's naval reforms, Egypt is well prepared. To make matters worse for the Crusaders, the tragic life of Baldwin IV is over. The king's final act was to try and secure peace by sending Raymond of Tripoli to negotiate a 4-year truce, which Saladin readily agrees to, because he has problems of his own with the Zengid ruler in Mosul, who is forming a coalition against him. But the leper king's successor, Baldwin Vis, a sickly child, and he dies just a year later, triggering a succession crisis. After a period of political turmoil, the throne passes on to Baldwin IV's sister, who in turn crowns her husband Guy of Lusignan as King of Jerusalem. But the new king is not able to control his vassal nobles. Then come troubling news from the south. In December 1186, Reynald of Châtillon once again violates the truce. He overruns another rich caravan, slaughters and imprisons many Muslims. Saladin immediately dispatches an envoy, demanding the return of hostages and treasure, threatening the truce-breaker with vengeance. But Reynald, resting on his laurels behind the walls of Kerak, refuses to even receive the envoy. Al-Adil, Saladin's brother and governor of Egypt, dispatches the Ayyubid fleet. Most of the Christian raiders are captured and executed on the order from the Sultan. Eulogies of Saladin abound in the Muslim community as he is yet again seen as the protector of Islamic holy places and pilgrimage routes. And then the tide turns in favor of the Muslims. In 1183, Aleppo finally surrenders to Saladin, who now becomes the mightiest ruler of the Muslim world, and the leader of a unified Muslim front against the Latin Crusaders. Exercising uncontested authority over Egypt and Syria, he is supported by the Sunni Caliph in Baghdad and is recognized as the Lord of Arabia and patron of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. But most importantly, ordinary Muslims that Saladin sought to bring together are jubilant that Islam is again united. The news of Saladin's conquest of Aleppo shocks the Crusader states. Saladin can now direct his vast resources to put pressure on the Kingdom of Jerusalem almost along its entire border. A devastating raid into Christian lands is followed by several probing attacks on the fortress of Kerak, testing the resolve of the Franks and putting strain on their resources. To make matters worse for the Crusaders, the tragic life of Baldwin IV is over. The king's final act was to try and secure peace by sending Raymond of Tripoli to negotiate a 4-year truce, which Saladin readily agrees to because he has problems of his own with the Zengid ruler in Mosul, who is forming a coalition against him. But the leper king's successor, Baldwin, is a sickly child, and he dies just a year later, triggering a succession crisis. After a period of political turmoil, the throne passes on to Baldwin IV's sister, who in turn crowns her husband Guy of Lusignan as King of Jerusalem. But the new king is not able to control his vassal nobles. Then come troubling news from the south. In December 1186, Reynald of Châtillon once again violates the truce. He overruns another rich caravan, slaughters and imprisons many Muslims. Saladin immediately dispatches an envoy, demanding the return of hostages and treasure, threatening the truce breaker with vengeance. But Reynald, resting on his laurels behind the walls of Kerak, refuses to even receive the envoy. Hearing of this, Saladin finally loses his patience and swears that he will take the life of Reynald with his own hand, Hisinger beyond words, beyond bounds. In early 1187, Saladin gathers his generals in Damascus to draw up plans for a major invasion. Messengers gallop to all corners of the state, urging action, vengeance, a war of liberation and annihilation. The words jihad and Jerusalem are on the lips of all Muslims who answer Saladin's call. Saladin leaves garrisons along the border to protect the northern flank and begins raiding Christian lands. During one of the raids, a chance encounter between a Muslim cavalry advanced guard and a Christian contingent of 130 knights, 400 Turcopoles and infantry at the Springs of Cresson ends in disaster for the Templars and Hospitallers. Heads of knights on lances and prisoners chained to horses are paraded in front of Tiberius. The calamity at the Springs of Cresson Isa wake-up call for the Christians, who quickly mend old rivalries and unite in the face of the conflict that is coming. On June 26, 1187, Saladin regroups his troops and marches towards the River Jordan. His army numbers around 30,000 and is divided into three wings, with Taqi al-Din commanding the right, Gokbori commanding the left, and Saladin himself in the center. On June 27th, the army reaches the River Jordan and makes camp in a marshy area near Lake Tiberias. Raiding parties are sent into Christian territory to ravage the area and set the stage for the invasion. Some 25 kilometers west, a Christian army, some 20,000 strong encamps near Saforia, a highly strategic location because of its rich water resources. On June 30th, Saladin sends a contingent north to block Tiberias and then challenges the Crusaders by moving his main camp closer to Saforia, some 10 kilometers west of Lake Tiberias. But as neither side takes action, Saladin decides to make the first move. On July 1st, he sends scouts to monitor an alternative road on his northern flank that connects Saforia and Tiberias. Later in the day, reports confirm that the Crusaders are not advancing on either route, and on July 2nd, Saladin takes the initiative. He marches east towards Tiberias with most of his infantry, a cavalry contingent, siege engineers, and their equipment. By late morning, they reach Tiberias, where Raymond's wife is staying, and they besiege the town. Not long after, Muslim troops breach the walls and the town is seized by nightfall. Raymond's wife barricades herself inside the citadel with her guards and sends messengers, urging King Guy to send help. Back west, plumes of smoke can be seen in the sky above Tiberias, and when news of the siege reaches the Crusader camp, King Guy holds a war council to debate what should be done. At first, Raymond of Tripoli makes a persuasive argument against marching to raise the siege, insisting that the Christian army has a strong defensive position at Saforia and should stay put. But the Count's cautiousness is met with accusations of cowardice and treachery, mainly from the Templar master Gerard de Ridefort and Reynald of Chatillon, who push for a more aggressive stance and put pressure on King Guy with strong political, military, and diplomatic arguments. Persuaded, the king sends a herald through the camp to sound the call that the army will march to the rescue of Tiberias at dawn. And on July 3rd, the Crusader army makes way. They set out with Raymond of Tripoli commanding the vanguard. King Guy leads the center where the Bishop of Acre carries Christendom's greatest relic, the true cross, on which Christ is believed to have been crucified. Balian of Ibelin commands the rear guard, where the Templars and Hospitallers are stationed. King Guy orders the men to march with haste, planning to reach the besieged town by the end of the day. But as noon approaches and the sun rises across the clear, cloudless sky, it becomes apparent that the day will be extremely hot. There is no breeze, and the scorching heat slows down the column. By midday, the army reaches the next watering point at the village of Turan, only 1/3 of the way. But as they press on, there is no escaping the sun and the thick dust raised by the marching troops. It becomes clear to King Guy and his officers that they will not reach Tiberias in a single day. As the column moves away from Turan, detachments of Saladin's fast-moving horse archers appear from nearby hills and begin harassing the Christians, cutting off their line of retreat. The Crusader infantry closes rank to protect the cavalry against hit-and-run attacks, but the number of casualties in men and animals begins to rise. The day wears on, and the constant harassment and sporadic clashes slow the Crusader rearguard down to a crawl, and they become separated from the rest of the army. Fearing the loss of his elite shock cavalry, King Guy orders the center to stop to allow the rearguard to catch up. He relays the message to Raymond, ordering him to halt the vanguard. But as the entire Crusader column gradually gets encircled by the ever-increasing number of Saladin's horse archers, it becomes clear that they have fallen into a trap. After quickly taking Tiberias, Saladin had time to return, leaving only a small garrison to block the citadel, and with his main contingent, he is now blocking the road. With nightfall fast approaching, the exhausted Christian fighters, slowed by thirst and hemmed in by Muslim forces, cannot fight their way past Saladin's fresh troops. King Guy has no choice but to order his men to make camp where they stand. Not far from the king's tent, the main Muslim contingent also encamps for the night. But the night ahead will be a difficult one for the Crusaders. Their column stretches some 2 kilometers and it's not protected by any natural terrain features. Muslim horse archers continue to pepper the camp throughout the night. Skirmishers clash with the Crusaders and set tents on fire along the camp perimeter. Unable to rest, and with their water supplies dwindling, the smoke and the heat from the fire drains the energy from the Christians. Come morning, things quiet down. Saladin waits for the heat to rise and to see what the Christians will do. Crusaders, now without any water and tormented by thirst, have only one aim, the village of Hattin, where there is a water source. They make way across the valley, keeping the same formation of 3 squares, with infantry shielding the cavalry. Saladin's troops set fire to the nearby brushwood, sending choking clouds of smoke on a westerly breeze towards the Crusaders. And with the sun beating down from the clear sky, the Christians push on towards Hattin, desperate to reach the water well. To prevent this, Saladin sends Taqi al-Din's wing galloping to block the valley, determined to fully encircle the enemy and not allow them to quench their thirst. He especially wants to wear down the knights and their heavy cavalry, aware of just how dangerous their frontal charge is. Taqi's skirmishers ride in close, then hit and run to test the flanks of the Christians. Horse archers then unleash volley after volley onto the Crusader column. Reportedly hundreds exhausted, thirsty, and disheartened, the Crusader infantry starts to break away from the mounted knights. They disperse and flee, with a large group heading east towards a hill called the Horns of Hattin, and another group fleeing north towards the village of Nimrin. Seeing the fleeing troops, Muslim riders open gaps their line to draw out the enemy infantry. King Guy and his officers realize that they are doomed unless they can break through. But the Muslims charge the rear of the column, and the Templars and Hospitallers become heavily engaged, forcing Guy to halt for a second time to prevent the cavalry formations from breaking up. But in the front, Raymond of Tripoli is already edging away from King Guy's cavalry formation. As he advances, the Muslim riders begin opening another gap in their line. Raymond decides not to sit and wait. He gathers his knights and charges Taqi al-Din's cavalry. The Muslim riders let the galloping Christians pass through, showering Raymond and his men with arrows as they retreat from the battlefield. Back in the smoke-filled valley, the Christian knights are dying. Guy orders the cavalry to move towards the Horns of Hattin through a gap already created by the retreating infantry. The knows that there are shallow pools of water at the top of the hill and hopes they are not dry. Meanwhile, on the hill, Saladin's troops close in and begin engage the Christian infantry. Exhausted, the enemy infantry barely put up a fight, and they are quickly overwhelmed. The Muslims then turn towards the King of Jerusalem himself. Throughout the incessant close-quarter fighting, Christian knights gather around to protect the true cross as they retreat towards the hill. But at the top, they find no relief and no water. King Guy rallies the knights and raises his red tent to provide a focal point. But to no avail. Muslim troops push up the slope and engage the Christians. In the melee, the true cross falls into Muslim hands. Seeing this, the surviving Christian knights rally and charge downhill to retrieve it, pushing the Muslim line back. But they have no fight left in them, and they soon begin to take heavy casualties. Finally, King Guy orders them to surrender. The knights dismount and collapse on the ground. King Guy is also found on the ground at his tent, utterly exhausted, barely having enough strength left to hand over his sword. Saladin's army has won a great victory. King Guy is captured along with many nobles and knights, among them Raylan of Châtillon. Saladin orders that ice-cold water be brought and offered to the king. Then, according to Imad al-Din, the king, having drunk some of it, handed the cup to Reynald of Châtillon. Whereupon the Sultan said to an interpreter, "Say to the king, 'It is you who give him to drink. but I give him neither to drink nor to eat." By these words, Saladin wishes that it be understood that honor forbade him to harm any man who had tasted his hospitality. And with that, he swings his sword and strikes Reynold on the neck, thus fulfilling his oath to kill the truce breaker. But more importantly, the large Crusader army that is destroyed at Hattin cannot be replaced. Without it, Christian castles, towns, and cities are now defenseless. By 1188, only Tyre and Acre hold out to spur Europe to embark on another crusade. But that is a story for another time. It is worth noting that we mainly focused on Saladin's military achievements in this video,